Hello everyone, today we talk about the rise of the Ottomans from their origins to the beginning of the 15th century. This is essentially a low and late medieval history that has today to take into consideration certain international conditions that triggered this and allowed the same rise of the Ottomans, who could have simply not reached at the power they eventually achieved. And this is very interesting because when we look at the history of empires, we generally look at these embryos and say, oh wow, their genetic characteristics had necessarily to make them rise at that point. Well, really no, and I think it's much more interesting to look at in a non-deterministic perspective, of course, which is always wrong in theory simply because we cannot prove determinism as such, but also because it adds so much, it shows the concrete ability and risks of these entities that could be wiped out at a certain point, but that instead were already at the beginning clever enough to exploit the favorable situation, to fill the gaps that had been left uncovered by others, and this is definitely what the Ottomans were doing. And we are in a time into which Western monarchies were heading towards a progressive consolidation. The Ottomans rose in this sense as new protagonists of Islamic history in the Mediterranean. And in this sense, I think one of the most important relations that we have to take in account is the one between the Ottomans and the Mamluks. Not much, because at the beginning of the 16th century, the Ottomans de facto conquered the Egyptian Sultanate. But also because the previous decline of the Mamluks had, in part, we can say, probably triggered or at least allowed the same rise of the Ottomans in Anatolia, because when we study this period, we like sometimes as Westerners, maybe even the Turks do that, I don't know, really there is a lot of there would be a lot to talk about concerning this. We tend to dramatize the Ottoman advance as this unstoppable thing that swept into fast into the heart of Europe, threatening Christianity and all. But the situation and political balances sometimes were not much different in other occasions. And if you look at the Sultanate of Egypt, you really see on a map that was something huge. I mean, it stretched from Sudan to Syria. It was a great superpower. It could definitely interfere into the Anatolian affairs that were very much fragmented, and that therefore on which Egypt, if not declining, could have really been able to play on, and maybe even invading it, the same Anatolia at one point. Let's spend some time to explain the decline of the Mamluk Empire, because indeed by the second half of the 15th century was an internal collapse of the Sultanate of Egypt, and the trade of spices between the Indian Ocean and the Nile ports through the waterways made up by the same Nile and the Red Sea definitely went on. Even though the Portuguese enterprise was already laying the basis for the circumnavigation of Africa, which would have taken away from Alexandria and Damat, the main Egyptian ports, what remained to them of the semi-monopoly of the commerce of the spices that from the Far East reach the Mediterranean, because that's something that eventually occurred in mass later. But this wasn't really much the reason. Even Sudanese gold was kept keeping to flow into Egypt, so the balance of payments was substantially healthy. But the real decline really happened probably at a political and social level into Egyptian society, because especially the Egyptian manufacturers were registering an irreversible decline. Mm. You can see that because because Egypt was literally invaded by products that came from Europe, from the Far East, so they were losing essentially on that point of internal production that could support a healthy middle class. And while the Mamluk elite was living in the excessive luxus, and especially military expenses were really rocketing, so the economical collapse eventually occurred for this reason. So the Ottomans, in this sense, were being in Anatolia quite happy of minding their own business and seeing the Egyptian interference really shrinking and expanding as Ottomans as a consequence. That wasn't the only cause, indeed. So what were the Ottomans essentially? Well, the new protagonists of Mediterranean history of the 15th century were a Turkish tribe that at the beginning of the 13th century, by the third decade of the 13th century, had been pushed by from Central Asia westwards by the Mongolian expansion. So this wasn't something really new in the Turkish world, because the Turks were essentially migrating to the Middle and Near East from the Asian steppes since many centuries. I made a video on the Seljuk Turks and how they began since the early Middle Ages to interfere with the Abbasid Caliphate and eventually rising to power into their into the Near and Middle East, especially as a strong military entity. And the Ottomans were doing in this sense a bit the same. Yes, they were pushed by the Mongols, but essentially they were on the footsteps of many other Turks with whom they kept sharing a certain culture. You have to think that when the Turks sedentarized into Anatolia, or that they kept essentially their own the contacts, and not just memory but also the contacts with the other Turkish or Mongolian populations. And in this sense it's even difficult to see a great difference between the Turks and the Mongolians at one point, because eventually the Mongolians became the empire, and that we know, so they surclassed in size by sheer size the Turks. But essentially the nomadic lifestyle had been the same, and especially these were very warlike peoples that lived into as great confederations of people that clashed cyclically once against the other, and there was normally a leading coalition that managed to subjugate other peoples that in this sense fought alongside them as subjects, and that were essentially horse archers, nomadic warriors that shared in this sense the same political and military rules, and that even when they sedentarized, recognized the ancient prestige of the the great steppes warlords, and in trying even to replicate the system of their political system of subjugation, we can say, with not just with locals but also with other entities that arrived in this sense. We will see it now. And even though sedentary life was a bit of another business, but just for saying that the Ottomans always retained memory of their steppes past. They were quite reverent towards the Mongols, or at least the remains of the Mongolian Empire, like the Khanate of the Golden Horde, that eventually was even partly conquered by the Ottomans in Crimea. But the most important thing is that this first nucleus of Turks, of Turkish tribe, settled into Anatolia, and or better, they had first come under the at the service of the Seljuk Sultan of Iconium, or Konya, that is in today's Turkey, who had basically assigned to them a small territory that wasn't not very far. It was not very far from Constantinople itself since those times. So they, in a certain sense, they lived at the borders of the Seljuk world. In this sense, they were put on a frontier, because warfare between Turks and Byzantines and other entities was pretty intense at the time. So it would be, I personally don't know it, but it would be interesting to see how that frontier location eventually influenced the characteristics of the same Ottoman of the Ottoman expansion. Indeed, these Turks were definitely stimulated by many elements, like, for instance, the proximity of the sea. So these great routes that existed were exploited by the Byzantines, by the Italians between the Black Sea and the Aegean Sea. The presence of very different kind of populations, from, like, in the Anatolian hinterland they had the Seljuks, then these Byzantine stripes of land on the Anatolian coast, and then Italian colonies all around, and from the other side in Europe, the still French principalities, then the Bulgarians, the Serbians. So again, the Ottomans were inserted very early into a very dynamic game that probably developed their intelligence in relatively to these international relations and the various opportunities that could arise from them to exploit. So by the end of the 13th century, this is when basically the Ottomans are born, because the Ottomans weren't a people but a dynasty. And a dynasty coming from the Khan Osman, or Ottoman. So this is a very early age, so sometimes we don't even know what the real practical name is. Sometimes even you find written in books the Osmanian Empire, because the guy was seemingly called Osman, more likely, but eventually Ottoman prevailed. This guy lived, however, we know at least that he ruled from 12 he was out there from 1291 to 1326. And the rise of this Khan, you see, the Khan is the general, the standard title of steppes rulers, and which was very important because it was the equivalent of you know, like of emperor or king. I mean, it was, as we were saying before, implicit into these titles that a Khan was a ruler of peoples, not just someone who was elected like uh, by someone else, like the feudal kings that theoretically were there to serve the people's rights. No, these were just, in theory, in terms of political theory and practice, let's say, along with the military one, um, um, conquerors, and rulers of subjugated populations. And Osman rose to power thanks essentially the rise of the Sultanate of Konya. The Sultanate of Konya, or Iconium, it was a very important entity in Anatolia. It was a major entity. It was the one that basically fought all the time with the Byzantine Empire, caused various defeats. The last one, the Battle of Myriokephalon, the they were like a sort of autonomous state from the rest of the Seljuk Empire proper in itself, and it's only at this time, after centuries, that it was beginning to decline. By the way, we should stress that this had never been actually centralized dominions. Like, as I was saying before, around this Sultanate of Konya, there were many other small sultanates, small kings and chieftains that constantly quarreled between each other as much as against the Byzantines. I mean, the alliances were quite fluid and not really based just on the normal dichotomy Christians, Muslims, but at this time everybody sought every form of agreement just to take advantage of the situation. So at that point the nucleus from which eventually the Ottomans rose was just one of those, so a very small one. The Sultanate of Konya was declining essentially because of the pressure of the Ilkhanate, the Mongols of Persia, and the Mamluks of Egypt. So you see here that even the Sultanate of Konya worked as a bit as like a shield from the Mamluk direction, but even the Persians would have been consistently enemies with the Ottomans at one point, and even halted their advance and kind of postponed the same fall of Constantinople. So you had you understand how very which large scale these international changes were really were occurring, and at the same time, so Osman was leaving at this very moment. At the same time, he took advantage of and eventually his successors as well, because he died in the meanwhile. The Ottomans benefited from the power, from the terrible fratricide clashes that were occurring in Constantinople between 1321 and 1355, that were very important because they were instrumental for the Ottomans to eventually set foot into Europe. Initially, these fights had been between Andronicus II and Andronicus III, then between John V and John VI, Cantacuzenos, all these figures that had a great importance made up the story of the Byzantine Empire at that time. And the successor of Ottoman, named Orkan, had gradually taken away from the empire during these clashes Bithynia with Prusa, or Brusa as you wanna call them, Iznik, that was the ancient Nicaea, and Nicomedia, and eventually even Gallipoli, that was so famous today in popular culture because of the battles, the battle that occurred during World War First. But this was one of the first. It was actually the first fortress that the Ottomans got on the European coasts of the Dardanelles, that therefore assured to them the control over these straits. That was definitely extremely profitable for them, because all the ships that had to pass from the Aegean Sea to the Black Sea had to pass through there. So the Ottomans, in this sense, began to even play with those powers that had been vital for the same recovery of the Byzantine Empire after the Fourth Crusade, that were namely the Italian maritime republics of Venice and of Genoa, and having this kind of dual relation with them, because formally they would be enemies in fate, but an agreement could be signed in the sense that the Italians wanted to pass into the Black Sea, because they had economical interests in there, and colonies and all, and raw materials to export and all. The Ottomans, in this sense, all they wanted was to cash, and by letting them pass, that was a very good mean to do so. So they would arrive to a compromise. But you have to think this being really something very unstable, and intermittent. Like one time they would be at war, and another time they at peace. So according to the world according to the international relations, they would change the side from which they were fighting. So either supporting the Byzantines or the Ottomans, etc. And the fortress of Gallipoli, in this sense, was also the access to the Balkanic peninsula proper. And what is interesting is that the Byzantines had actually even allied themselves as well with the Ottomans. As a matter of fact, Kantakouzenos had used the same Turks to reach power, and yet he soon found out that his capital was almost being choked by the Ottomans that were surrounding it. And in this sense, there is a very interesting aspect of the Ottoman advance, that was something that took place in the early times, much more in Europe than in Asia proper. Like, the Ottomans were really close to the Dardanelles, and their immediate, the objective was first of all taking the Dardanelles, but also eventually expanding into Europe. That was more profitable than certain areas of Anatolia, and that was even more fragmented, more unstable to exploit. And the very first territories into which the Ottomans expanded in grand scale were actually the Thracian ones. At this point, telling the truth, the Ottomans could have been wiped out, and this is what I was referring to before, by a power that was rising into the Central Balkans. That was Serbia. Serbia at that time was ruled by the Tsar Stefan Dusan. I don't know how you pronounce that, and that had reached really a huge power. He could have even managed to unify the world Balkans by creating By the way, a new state on the ruins of Byzantine administration, because all of these Slavic powers were really well acquainted with the Byzantines with the Byzantine practices of politics and administration since centuries. So the Byzantine Empire was slowly dying out, and they were clever to enough, obviously, to take advantage from the ruins of that statal system that the Roman Empire had been, and using it to structure a more, especially a more centralized dominion that had been something difficult to do among the Slavs, because they retained essentially sort of clanic um, organization to which various families were struggling for power. So the Byzantine state, in this sense, was a model that many Arabs wanted to replicate, including the Ottomans, that eventually made it to basically recreate the Roman Empire in part. I mean, obviously it's an heresy to say from a Roman perspective, but definitely the Ottomans claimed themselves to be Caesars eventually. So, and indeed Constantinople became a great city again after the Turks conquered it, while in the late Byzantine times it had steadily declined. But relatively to Stefan Dushan, he died in 1355, and Orkan, son of Ottoman, took advantage of this to eventually sweep into the Balkans and to take in 1361 the city of Adrianople, today Edirne. That was one of the most important cities had been one of the most important cities of the Byzantine Empire. It's northwest of Constantinople, and in this sense, it's very meaningful that the Ottomans shifted a few years later under Murad I in 1366 their capital into Adrianople. So this had a very important meaning internationally speaking, because first of all, the Ottomans were shifting their capital into Europe. So they immediately told to Europe, look, that we're gonna expand here. Their aim was evidently the Danube plain and the Adriatic Sea. And plus, they were quite close to Constantinople and basically surrounding it by land. So that was also quite important in strategical terms to cut off the communications with Constantinople by land, from land and sea. In this sense, the major problem were the Italian navies, that because the Ottomans weren't, and the Turks weren't much of great sailors at this time, they were still relatively at this time. The Ottoman army wasn't the one that it would have become later. It's just at this point when the Ottomans began to seize more land, that they began to conceive of something more unitary in terms of administration, in terms of the army, and we will be seeing it right now. But they still lacked a lot, and I think that one great characteristics of the Ottomans was, in this sense, the ability, from a certain time onwards at least, to eventually take the best from everyone. This is a bit like the Romans did, which doesn't have to be exchanged for or mistakenly interpreted for like a copy. Ah, yeah, this guy is just copied. No, because you need a hell of a civilization to be capable of absorbing other cultures' achievements, and to make a synthesis of them that eventually allows you to overcome them. So it's not really inferiority. in this sense, but it's a great form of superiority, and part of this, according to me, happened crucially because the Ottomans were quite mixed as a power since the beginnings. Like it seems that they didn't have up to from a certain point onwards at least particular cultural resistances, while the I don't know the Golden Horde or other peoples that were similar origins to the Ottomans kind of insisted in their traditionalist perspectives, like, oh yeah, we are the old um, the descendants of the old masters, the great Khan of Mongolia and all. The Ottomans were a bit more like the bastards of the situations that the situation that rose to power from a relative nothingness and mixing really with many other communities, and therefore losing part of their original um, traditions and identity. But exactly for this reason, they were more open, mm, and they were more capable of reading through multiple civilizations and really dealing with them more effectively for their expansion, for the strengthening of their own rule. And this is very crucial, according to me, when you study the Ottomans, because you realize that when we say the Turks, well, what are the Turks really? You know, if you go to Turkey and you go there, you see that indeed, you know, many Turks look very white, and this is not surprising considering that there were a lot of eventually of deportations of Balkanic people into Anatolia, but simply Anatolia had been Indo-European in great part since the time of the Hittites, and then the Greeks, the Romans, um, the same Byzantines and all their multi-ethnic, um, uh, you know, their acceptance of people of various ethnicities, mostly from the European side, Indo-European. So uh, who were the Turks in that sense? The Turks that arrived in at the beginning of the 13th century had been diluted already, ethnically speaking, into that melting pot. So some of the guys you see here were blonde, were blue-eyed. So who were the Turks in this sense? And this is something that you cannot say for other powers. That indeed mixed always, like if you look at Crimea, if you look at Persia, you know, they weren't Mongolians, of course, but in a certain sense they were closer to the origin of the steppes. The Ottomans weren't. The Ottomans were exposed to much greater cultural influences, also the longer range. The presence of the sea is crucial in this sense because obviously people travel also a lot by land, but the sea is really like a mind opener that like a few others. So you can argue that the Ottomans made it also thanks to the fact that they were very malleable. They were quite open-minded, and you can see that in many ways, especially in their military traditions. That will be seen in a new way. So, first of all, so we are essentially in the second half of the 14th century. We neither make it to the 15th, really, as I see it. But what is important is that as early as this time, as the second half of the 14th century, the the Ottoman court was practically becoming already a center of culture on its own. Mm. And this is interesting because it was fueled and encouraged by um, an epic Turkish literature. Mm, or better, Turkish epic literature that, in this sense, was becoming after Arab and Farsi, the Persian, what would have become uh, um, basically the third major linguistical element of Islam. Mm. So Turkish rising thanks to the Ottomans after so many years that the Turks already existed in the Arab world, but that had evidently been more about war than literature. Here the Ottomans were able to eventually even develop a great cultural um, civilization in the Islamic world. But militarily speaking, this is what I'm mostly fascinated by, is that the Ottomans were really shaping themselves as a new emerging power in a very peculiar way. Um, the um, uh, the and that was definitely emerging from a more traditional background. The major, uh, we have to think here. We have to talk about the Godsey. The Godsey essentially were riders or raiders that better raiders that had been that were the expression of those old Turkish cavalrymen that rode the steppes, riding for booty and and eventually making it to invade the caliphate and serving as mercenaries and all. And the term of Ghazi, originally speaking, was very was very neutral, was very devoid of great meaning. Obviously, being a raider was something praised into that nomadic societies, and indeed the Turkoman Ghazi that were used into the Near East, even by the Crusader states as mercenaries and all, were the backbone of the Turkish armies at the time. But the problem with these Ghazis was that they were still framed into an old clientery system that was pretty much reminiscent um, of the relations that existed between warlords and raiders in the steppes. So differently from the Western mercenaries that began to organize themselves into mercenary companies, and eventually with the condotte or the Indian tours, kind of qualifying themselves as essentially professionals of war. These guys were kind of more tied to the old idea of following freely the lord that was more powerful. So they could theoretically potentially always fuel certain rebellions, and the Islamic world was pretty was definitely not new to this. Also because there was a religious ideal behind this, that is that he who fails into war is essentially not just a loser, but it's someone that has kind of been downsized by God because of his hubris of having kind of even usurped in part the terrain, the earthly power that belongs from the Muslim perspective entirely to God. So this sometimes was an excuse for these Ghazis to really alter the political situation after that a warlord had been weakened, and they were very difficultly frameable into a permanent military structure. So the Ottomans invented at this time the very famous system of the devshirme, which means the forced levy of Christian boys, and basically the difference here is that while the Godseys were these figures that were of very low social status, and they sometimes it was this tradition of arming the slaves that already existed there. For instance, the Mamluks had risen in that fashion. They were essentially slaves um, that were slaves because of the same relation with the warlord that had theoretically conquered them, and had therefore they had to obey to him. That eventually were armed and could, as I was saying, cause revolts. So that path, as we've seen, was quite risky. What do you arm a slave for? He's gonna rebel, as it happened in practice. Um, the Christian boys were different, because the Christian boys were taken literally from these Balkanic regions, mostly of Albania. The Ottomans were also searching for tough human exemplars that could be, in this sense, also effective into combat from a physical point of view. They raided them periodically, and taking them away from their families. Sometimes you have to imagine this Balkanic shepherd communities like fleeing to the mountains, to the forests, to avoid their children to be kidnapped by the Turks. And these boys were selected to become they weren't really selected to become all warriors, because some of them, the most intelligent, were actually selected for administration. But the tougher ones were eventually destined to military service. The great thing, why Christian boys? Because they had to be completely, because they had to be strangers. I don't know how many Muslims have entered into the Devonshire accidentally or normally, let's say. But the Christians, in this sense, were conceived as complete strangers that had no ties to the to the local Ottoman society, and that therefore had no other family than the Sultan in practice. It wasn't something so unusual. You have to think that the idea of having guards, personal guards that come from other societies, or rather even with of a different religion than yours, was something quite common. Like the emirs of Cordoba had Christian guards, even if they fought extensively against the Christians, and this tells you how religion had really nothing to do in practice with the reality of how politics and war actually happen. And they would choose the Christians because they weren't connected to the local Muslim society, so they couldn't be friends with local Muslim lords that could rebel to the emiral power. The same was the case of in reverse of the Muslim guard of Frederick II. Frederick basically took all these Arab brigands that dwelled into Sicily, spreading terror and fear. He slaughtered their chief, and he settled them all into a city, into Apulia. In this sense, they had quite a substantial privileges, and the reason for doing this is that in a Christian world, these Muslims lived into that island only because the emperor, the king of Sicily at that time, also Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, had allowed them to do. So the best way to maintain that was to be faithful to that king, and in fact the Saracens of Lucera were definitely quite effective forces. This happened with the Ottomans, even though in a different way, in the sense that these Christian boys were eventually educated as Muslims, by the way, with a very a strong indoctrination that was at the they were educated in Islamic faith sometimes even with a monastic regimes. You know that in the Muslim world there are certain Sufi rules that basically are something similar to the to Western monasticism, or at least comparable to Western monasticism. And these boys were therefore meant to be raised as soldiers with a very strong Islamic faith. And this militia was called the New Militia, the Janissary, so the Janissaries, hence the name of this corps. And they, in fact, they were basically lodged into certain barracks that made up that had even a certain monastic character in itself, to reinforce the Islamic faith, and were distinguished by this white headgear, and really raised with an extremely harsh discipline and with a very stern way of life. They didn't have to marry, and they had to belong to their same religious brotherhood, the Tariqa Bektashiya. I believe that's the right pronunciation. And therefore, being born as this very effective corps that eventually had such a great importance, not just in the military but also in the political story of the Ottoman Empire, eventually becoming like a bit the Praetorians, and supporting the election of certain sultans and also. And this is a very important note that you can make about the Ottomans, in the sense that they began to create a professional army, which is not something that you have to give for granted at that time, because the Europeans weren't doing that yet. There were, maybe it's at this time that the King of France keeps maintaining troops, not just from the seasonal service, and therefore creating this very early core of permanent troops. So maybe the Ottomans are comparable in this sense, but it's still very meaningful that they had the resources and the abilities to put up this system that eventually, as we know, developed quite efficiently over time. And this happens usually when you start having the resources to maintain someone for a prolonged military service, in the sense that it's not that medieval powers were stupid because they didn't have a professional permanent army. It's simply that they couldn't have it because they were usually too small political entities, given the fragmentation of the political landscape that existed at the time, and it wouldn't even make sense to have permanent troops. But when enough resources were available, it would be normal to create permanent troops and eventually structure even the state, especially fiscally speaking, to draw the resources to maintain them. Well, this is what the Ottomans start doing when they had already a substantial power into the into both across Asia and Europe at this time, even more Europe than Asia, as we were saying, and therefore looking at further expansion that in this sense required increasingly skilled troops. And while the majority, the average of the other Muslim powers, of minor Muslim powers, was at the time relying on the Turkoman Godseys, and therefore this kind of very unreliable and temporary force that couldn't fight forever, that was mostly attached to the fortunes of their own masters, rather than devotion and discipline, like in the case of the Janissaries. So it is very important to document, to consider it when thinking about the rise of the Ottomans, because usually when at this time when power was substantially strong, it usually began to feel the permanent at least permanent bodies of armies. Then obviously permanent corps, military corps, sorry, not bodies of armies, doesn't mean anything. And however, this was also a progressive thing in the sense that mercenaries and other less reliable troops were being regularly used next to the Janissaries, and this actually would have remained an average Ottoman habit given the same nature of the Ottoman Empire, because the Janissaries formed this kind of guard of the capital, but the Ottoman Empire was so extended. I mean, the Janissaries obviously would also go in campaign in everywhere in the empire, but together with the Sultan and all. But the empire was so huge at one point that it was necessarily needed to have local forces to be organized. In fact, locally for the local defense. So this would produce the rise of certain troops from the local Ottoman provinces that were called Timar, if I'm not wrong, and each region, in this sense, each province produced troops that were typical of that province. So even with very different military traditions, usually non-professionals, I mean light troops of usually light infantry. You know, the Ottomans in this sense were quite advanced in artillery, in combined arms, tactics, but what they lacked compared to the Europeans was on average a strong body of infantrymen, like like it was being formed in the pike and shot tactics into the Western armies. But they compensated with other elements in this sense, and the Janissary elite was definitely something very effective. The majority of the troops being made up of the Azabs, or the Azats, sorry. These kind of light troops that followed in huge numbers, by the way, and that were sent at waves against the enemies. But we will have more time in the future to talk about the Ottoman armies more in detail. For now, I just wanted to give you this picture. I mean, how the Ottomans progressively, and also thanks to the chances that the international situation offered, managed to carve their own regional scale power from the small and Turkish tribe that they were when they had arrived in the previous century into Anatolia, and this is definitely fascinating. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel for receiving notifications about my new contents. For now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.